In this section of the course, we are reading Plato's Euthyphro. And we're reading the Euthyphro primarily for two reasons. One, the Euthyphro teaches us how to think well. And two, the Euthyphro addresses a question that should interest us as Christians, an important question, which is what is God's relation to morality? So first, why read the Euthyphro to learn how to think well? The Euthyphro is a dialogue written by Plato, and Plato lived from 428 BC to 347 BC. Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Now, some people would say that Plato's views about justice or things like that are arcane and outdated. Of course, what do you expect from someone who was one of the pioneers of philosophy? He didn't have centuries of philosophical scholarship to rely on when coming up with his views. Even if you think that, though, there is still a lot that is worthwhile in Plato. And one of the things that is worthwhile, one of the things he does so well, and his teacher Socrates did so well, is reason, think through things, and devise a method for thinking through things logically. And although we can learn a lot of things about reasoning well from Plato's dialogues, we're going to focus on one thing in particular: asking the right questions and knowing when to ask them, how to think through things in the correct logical order, and uncovering the logical structure of truth. Now, when you think about it, you were taught lots of things growing up. You were taught history, math, science, grammar, language. We didn't think that we would be able to just acquire that knowledge just from the society around us, that we would have to be taught them or those things directly. But one thing most of us haven't been taught directly is how to reason well. We haven't been taught logic, and logic is the very foundation of good reasoning. So the idea, I suppose, is that although we're not expected to learn math by just absorbing the habits of people around us, we're supposed to learn how to reason well by simply paying attention to how people reason around us and emulating or imitating their reasoning. And that would be fine if we were surrounded by lots of cases of people who typify the intellectual virtues, who understand logic, who are well-read, and they have learned to imitate people who reason outstandingly. But instead, we're surrounded by lots of bad examples that typify the intellectual vices, that use all sorts of informal logical fallacies. That wouldn't be that big a deal if we occasionally read some great books written by brilliant people and we could just learn to emulate their style of thought or their style of writing. But we live at a time at which people think it's a badge of honor not to be well read. In fact, they think it might be harmful to read good books. So we're supposed to acquire the ability to reason well through osmosis, through the habits of others. But the context or the situations in which we learn how to reason are usually not ones well suited to reasoning well. Just think of all the bad examples we're inundated with of logical mistakes or bad reasoning in Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, TV, the movies. Consider Twitter. Twitter is the worst place to acquire habits of reasoning, to learn to reason well. Given the limitations, it encourages short-sighted, quick replies that are overly simplistic, and it encourages you to stop the discussion sooner rather than later. In fact, it encourages the use of logical fallacies like abusive ad hominem or hasty generalization or the you too fallacy. So there's nothing wrong with Twitter. Twitter's great. It's great for what it was invented for, but it is the wrong context to be carrying on rational debates. It encourages us to use methods designed to silence people rather than rationally disagree with them. In fact, it encourages name calling. You need to silence someone as soon as possible. What are you going to do? You're not going to resort to good reasoning. You're going to resort to things that are persuasive or that make people feel bad, but aren't necessarily conducive to getting at the truth. In fact, we have so many bad habits of reasoning that logicians and philosophers at some point got together and said, there are so many bad examples, let's just come up with names for them so we can identify them. And those are called the informal fallacies. So here's a book on the informal fallacies. And the informal fallacies extend from pages 83 to 245. There's a lot of them, like the fallacy of sweeping generalization or bifurcation, the fallacy of begging the question or special pleading, the fallacy of false cause or slippery slope, fallacy of mob appeal, all sorts of instances of logical failures, of bad examples of reasoning that we continue to commit over and over. In fact, what the current studies show is that we are not prone to think through things. That is, when we're trying to defend something we believe, we don't really search for the truth. What we search for is a rationalization for what we believe. So we try to find reasons that support our beliefs, and usually they don't have to be that good. And when we consider arguments against what we believe, we require the arguments to be outstanding. We make the requirements much harder than it is for the requirements of acquiring reasons for believing what you do. So much so that it's almost impossible to satisfy the standard, so that we're just justified in dismissing what other people have to say. So we reason pretty well about things around us, things that we can touch and see and hear. But when it comes to some of the most pressing matters of human existence, like justice and truth and good and evil and right and wrong, we don't find ourselves to be that skilled in those domains. Now, secondly, the Euthyphro raises the issue of God's relation to morality, which is not something a lot of us have considered. We have considered God's relation to the universe. We know that God created the universe out of nothing, that he created the laws of nature, that he decided how many trees there would be, how many planets there would be. All those things were up to God. In fact, he had choices as to what to create. He made the earth such that objects fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, but could he have created the earth such that objects fall at 10.8 meters per second squared? It seems like he could have. We know his relation to us, that God created us in his image. But what about some other things? Not the physical world, but other things we think we know that we don't really ask the question, what is God's relation to them? Like mathematics. God created the world. He created truths about this world. Did he also create the truth that 333 is greater than 2? And what about the rules of morality? Lying is wrong. Is that something God just knew, being infinitely wise, and he told us lying is wrong? Is it an eternal truth that lying is wrong, like the mathematical truths seem to be? Or is it something that God brought into existence? Did he create that moral truth by forbidding lying? The Euthyphro is great because it raises this dilemma. What is God's relation to morality in particular? Is something right because God commands it, or does God command it because it is right?